Hi everybody, Scott Stanchfield here. Let's talk about widgets. We've seen this picture before. This is my application components high-level diagram. So far we've talked about activities, services. We haven't really touched on content providers. That's something I'm going to have as an extra for the course. It's an older module, less preferred way of doing things at this point. Still interesting, but I'm going to de-emphasize that. And now we're going to talk a little bit about broadcast receivers, but I'm going to de-emphasize that as well. Google has kind of nerfed the power of a broadcast receiver in favor of other types of APIs like the job scheduler. But we still have to deal with broadcast receivers for widgets. Let's start out talking about that broadcast receiver. First of all, these are intended to receive intents that are what's called broadcast intents. We've used intents to start services, we've used intents to start activities, but you can also broadcast an intent, and every matching receiver will receive those broadcast intents unless somebody along the line cancels them. The idea here is that this is a way for the system to tell everybody, hey, guess what? My power state has changed, or my network connection state has changed. There are many other ways you can use it, but typically the system is going to communicate to you. The idea is that in your receiver, once that broadcast is sent out, your receiver is instantiated, performs some processing, and then goes away. This is intended for very short processing, and I want to stress the word very here. This runs on the user interface thread. If you have a bunch of things listening for broadcast intents and they all wake up, they all have to get instantiated, they all have to do their processing, this could slow things down. And this is in fact why Google nerfed a lot of the support for this. You used to be able to catch tons and tons of broadcasts implicitly. Now you're really limited to using explicit intents, and we'll talk about that in a minute, with a few exceptions that they whitelisted to still allow people to catch. Eventually I suspect they're going to replace those as well, giving you different APIs. It's very important that you don't start an activity or show a dialogue or a toast or any type of user interaction from a broadcast receiver. This is very jarring to the user. There might be one or two little exceptions that you might want to use this for, but in general, this is a background thing. You don't want it to pop something up in the user's face. It could be jarring. It could interrupt the flow of what they're doing. If you do want to communicate, this would be a place where you could use notifications. So your broadcast receiver receives some information and you pop a notification up. Don't get up in the user's face with these. A little gotcha on this, a few Android releases ago, they added in a requirement that anytime you register a broadcast receiver in your manifest, it will not be invoked until the user has seen an activity at least once from that application. This is to prevent some quote-unquote clever malicious applications from tricking you into downloading them and not having any indication to the user that something's going on in the background intercepting these events. So here's the big however. As I mentioned, Google nerfed these in Oreo. There's a lot of things you can no longer do. You used to be able to register for implicit intent broadcasts inside your manifest. And what that means is when the system sends out one of these implicit intents, saying something like, hey, the battery state changed, you could put in your manifest a receiver that would say, hey, whenever the battery state changes, let me go do something. They've whitelisted a few things, not too many of them, so that you can still do these types of actions. But they have not restricted if you register these programmatically. And what this means is in your activity, you can explicitly create an instance of a broadcast receiver and ask the system to register it for you. Or you can use what's called a local broadcast manager, which keeps the communication strictly within your application. They figured that the user is already interacting with your application, so receiving a broadcast from the system isn't a big deal at that point. But in many cases, there's other ways of doing the type of communication you'd use these for anyway. One of the most common things that people want to do using a broadcast receiver was to start up an event in the background every once in a while to check to see, hey, do I have network connection? If so, let me go back some things up, or let me store some stuff in a database on a server somewhere, or let me download the weather information. Instead, what you can do is use the job scheduler to handle that by setting up a task that says what you want to perform under certain circumstances. We're not going to get into that here. That's something I'd like to point you to as an interesting thing if you want to have some actions handled based on certain states. You know, maybe you're plugged in, maybe you're on battery, maybe you're on Wi-Fi versus on a metered connection. You can set that up using a job scheduler. The only broadcast receivers that I'm going to deal with here are widget providers because there's no other way to deal with them right now. What we'll do is define a widget provider, which is just a broadcast receiver, and he is the guy who's going to be responsible for setting up and changing the state of a widget on the home screen. If you want to see a little more information about the nerfing that happened, take a look at that URL at the bottom there. At that site, they talk about why they did things and exactly which intents are still allowed to catch implicitly. Widgets are little mini applications that run outside your application on the home screen. Keep in mind these are running outside the bounds of your application. That means that you cannot directly set the data. Normally when we have a view, we say things like set text. Well, if it's in a different process, you can't do that. So what they've provided is an interface called remote views. And the remote views essentially captures a set of commands that you want to execute against the user interface. And then you tell the widget manager to execute all those as a batch. Now because of this, they had to limit which views are available. You can't create custom views and put them on the home screen. It'd be impossible for remote views to know what your object actually is. So they limited it to a certain set of layouts, views, and collections. Layouts are just going to organize the views on the screen, and they allow having frame layout, linear layout, relative layout, grid layout, and view flipper. View flipper is one that just takes any number of views and swaps between them. Note that we cannot use constraint layout. When I was coming up with the example for this part of the course, I accidentally started putting in a constraint layout, and when I tried running it, it blew up in my face and it told me it didn't know how to deal with a constraint layout in a widget. Serves me right for not thinking that through. I just copied some code, thought it would work, and didn't even think about it. The views are fairly limited as well. You can use an analog clock, a button, chronometer, image button, image view, progress bar, and text view. Very limited interface on this guy. But you can actually do quite a bit with just this limited number of views. We also allow for collections, and these are things kind of like the recycler view. They don't support recycler view, they only support the old school list view, which was in the original version of Android for doing lists. Recycler view is a more highly optimized version of it. They support here a list view, which is a list of things like the recycler view, a grid view, which will allow you to show views in a two-dimensional grid. That's great for showing like a photo gallery or something like that. Stack view, which has components on top of each other, and you can kind of see the edges of the things below them, so you can swipe through them, almost like a stack of photographs. An adapter view flipper, which is kind of similar to view flipper, except you set up an adapter to say which components are inside of it. Let's talk about the parts that you need to set up for a widget. And I know this can kind of seem overwhelming. This would probably be a good slide to print out so you can see which pieces you need for a widget. We're going to start over here with the manifest. This is your normal Android manifest, and you're going to start defining the widget as a broadcast receiver in the manifest. You use the receiver tag for that. That broadcast receiver specifies what's called a widget provider. That widget provider is the thing that has your code to create the commands to update the views in the widget. We'll come back to him in a minute. The receiver also has a bit of metadata that adds in something called a widget info XML. The widget info XML describes several properties of the widgets, including a preview image. This is what you'll see when you go to the widget chooser if you want to drop a widget on your home screen. Sizing information, like what your minimum size is, if the user can resize it, things like that. And the initial widget layout XML. This is going to define what the layout looks like on the screen using that limited set of widgets. When the user goes and adds your widget to the home screen, we'll get an instance of the widget created using that widget layout XML. It can be modified over time, but the initial one is what's inside that widget info XML. In that widget, we're going to have some views, we could have some collections. This is going to describe what they see on the screen. Once that widget is added, the widget provider will be poked to say, hey, how should I set my data up on there? The widget provider will then create a remote views object, which includes some commands to do things like set properties of the views. For example, you might say, I want to change the text on a text view. Creating new views or changing the layout in other ways. Attaching intents so that when the user taps on things, we can send off broadcasts or we can start activities. And setting adapter services so that collections will know how to get the data that they need to display on the screen. If you set those adapter services, you first of all create an instance of a remote views service. This service just has a single method you need, and that single method creates the adapter. The adapter is a subtype of remote views factory. This remote views factory looks fairly similar to the adapter that we used in our recycler view. The collection can then bind to that service to get the adapter, and then the adapter is going to send commands to the collection when asked to be able to set up the views in the screen. So the collection can find out how many views are going to be there. It can ask to create the view for each individual row, etc. In the next video, we're going to take and put all this together to create a little widget.